Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the From Innovation to Learning, Creating a CDRFI Roadmap workshop. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Cisse. I'm a Senior Research Manager at MCII. I'm here today with Zunke Kraft, who's the Executive Director of MCII and a Head of Section for the UN University Institute for Environment and Human Security, as well as Katerina Nett, who is an advisor for the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership Secretariat. So the goal of this week's workshop is to get started on the development of an evidence roadmap for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. We've noticed that over the past several years, there has been substantial innovation around disaster risk finance. Lots of new solutions have been trialed and different types of financial instruments have been created. However, not all of that innovation has been accompanied by adequate learning and evidence. So the goal of this workshop is to come together really with the whole community to identify what is the current knowledge that exists, to also work together to identify what work is being done, what activities are going on right now, what are implementers working on, and what are researchers working on. And then what are the gaps, the areas, the wide open areas and the small gaps that need to be addressed moving forward. So the idea is building on this knowledge of current evidence as well as work being done in the gaps, we can come together to develop an evidence roadmap which will direct evidence investments and activities moving forward. So that is the long-term goal, the creation of this evidence roadmap. But this week during this workshop, we're going to work to get started on that process. So the purpose of the roadmap is to ensure that climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions are efficient and effectively support vulnerable and exposed people, communities, and countries. So before we get started with the actual workshop today, we'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So just some general information. Each Zoom session today and the subsequent days will be recorded and posted on our website. As you will have noticed, today is a Zoom webinar format. So we do want people to participate. Please use the Q&A feature to add points that you would like to have discussed, ask questions, or make comments. But then for the rest of the week, Wednesday through Friday, we'll be using a Zoom conference format. So we encourage everybody to use their video to join in the conversation. And we definitely would like a good discussion and lots of participation. If you have any technical issues or questions, please email us at mcii@ehs.unu.edu. The other thing I wanted to mention in housekeeping is that we are doing a lot to try to encourage asynchronous participation. So you can check out our webpage. The link is there for all of the different participation options. This is not just for people who can't join live, but even those of you who are joining live, we would love to have you participate in these other ways. You will see all of the evidence briefs for different thematic areas listed there. Each of the briefs has also been uploaded as a Google Doc, so we encourage input, comments, as well as missing evidence and literature. We've created Mendeley groups for those who are interested in seeing what the published journal literature is available and for contributing to that as well. And then also you can follow along at on Twitter at MCII, and we have a series of different hashtags that we'll be using throughout the week. The ongoing hashtag is evidence roadmap. So that's those are the different options for asynchronous participation. So finally, before I hand it over, I'd just like to quickly overview what we're going to be discussing today. So today we're going to start with an opening and framing. This will be of the Vision 2025 of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, and the evidence roadmap will be discussed more in detail. So the presenters will be Katerina Nett and Zunke Kraft. Then we'll turn over to a discussion of the ProPort principles and success criteria with Zunke and with Swenja Serminski from LSE Grantham. And then finally, hopefully for the last half an hour or so, we'll open it up to a Q&A panel with all of the different presenters from today. And so we do encourage you, as I already mentioned, to use the Q&A feature to send in questions or comments for discussion. So now I will turn it over to Katarina for her presentation.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and welcome everyone to the webinar. So I'll start with a little bit of framing and background, starting with the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, and then talking a bit more about our vision and the role that impact plays in our work and what it means for us. So, so what is the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership? I mean, we're living in a situation, I don't have to say much about that, but we all know that climate impacts and disasters are continuing and increasing to devastate lives and livelihoods, decreasing GDPs, and impacting long-term development and growth of countries worldwide, but the impact is being felt greatest among poor and vulnerable communities. So as part of a broader strategy to enhance resilience, one approach is to put prearranged and predictable financing in place for early action, relief, and recovery through climate and disaster risk financing and insurance instruments. With the objective to help governments and also communities to manage risks better before they occur, and then to help reduce the impact of shocks and bounce back better after an extreme event. Ultimately, with the objective to strengthen people's and countries' ability to deal with these sorts of climate and disaster risks through financial resilience. So against this backdrop and with these ideas in mind, the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership was launched in 2017. It's a multi-stakeholder collaboration platform of G20 and V20 countries, and also with members from the private sector, civil society, and international organizations and academia, all coming together to support this agenda around financial protection against climate change. And we currently have around 84 members to date. So the partnership is built around a very clear vision, which is also part of our Vision 2025 that I'll talk about later. So the vision is to strengthen the resilience of developing countries and protect lives and livelihoods of poor and vulnerable people against the impacts of disasters. So the partnership strives to do so by enabling access to more timely and reliable disaster response and climate and disaster risk finance and insurance solutions. The partnership operates through mainly 4 work streams. This is how we center our work, and starting with work on strategic guidance and convergence, which is around setting the direction of the partnership. Then we work on capacity building and knowledge management. So really working together with all our members and other stakeholders to develop and increase knowledge on CDRFI. And we have a work stream which is action and implementation. This is where we collaborate with a number of different programs and projects that are implementing and well, strive to also support more coherence, a more coherent approach among these. And finally, we have our collaborative network work stream, which is really working together with all our partners and members, and also including a number of different working groups. And our M&E or impact work and activities kind of feed into all of these work streams, but of course, mainly also into capacity building and knowledge management part. So Inter-Resilience, the global partnership was launched in 2017, but Inter-Resilience goes back to 2015 already. This was the year when the G7 countries launched the Inter-Resilience Initiative, which was an initiative specifically on climate risk insurance with the goal to increase access to climate risk insurance for 400 million poor and vulnerable people. And now, 2 years later, the partnership was launched with a much broader vision, building on this, but with a broader vision and with a broader set of instruments. So this also meant a shift for our M&E framework. So before that, we had a very clear-cut numerous target, this 400 million target, which was mainly around aggregating beneficiary numbers and ensuring consistency in methodology, also throughout all the different programs and years. And we are currently in a phase where we are shifting this framework from the G7 target to our Vision 2025, which was launched and endorsed in 2019. And it's really, the focus is to develop a more comprehensive and partnership-wide M&E framework together with all our partners. And this framework aims to capture the more holistic scope of the partnership. So looking at broader impact dimensions, not just looking at the numbers and beneficiaries, but also looking at quality of solutions offered, etc., and providing more evidence on long-term resilience impacts. Right, so this is a little snapshot of our Vision 2025. And the 6 result areas that we have. So mainly the first 3 result areas of Vision 2025 focus on more easily countable figures that can be captured in quantitative surveys. Sorry. So the idea is to measure them on an annual basis within a survey and also complement them by additional numbers and data sets. So I'll go through them to give you an idea. So we look at the number of people protected and total risk covered. That's basically very similar also to what we did under the G7 framework. But then we have additional indicators looking at numbers of countries that have a comprehensive risk finance strategy in place, and also looking at countries that have adopted CDRFI solutions as part of a more comprehensive risk management. These are the first 3, and then the other 3 are more on a qualitative levels and focus on longer term effects. So we look at increased cost effectiveness and value for money of the solutions offered. We look at the development and human impact that these solutions have. And finally, we look at how the partnership contributes to increasing evidence around what is most effective and most cost efficient. So that being said, we are currently setting up this framework and refining indicators and target levels. But the goal of this M&E system that we're putting up is more to keep track of progress that's made towards the result areas and to look at what the programs and projects have achieved. But what this framework can't do is it cannot tell us or it doesn't tell us what changes can be attributed to which intervention in particular. So the indicators that we have currently defined look more at outcomes and not so much on the impact level. And that is simply because that wouldn't be possible to do it on an annual basis. So clearly what we see is that we need to complement this framework also with additional evaluations that can cover broader and more transformational impacts and can look at how the various instruments can give rise to development impacts and what can be the enabling conditions to support this. So, and this brings me to the M&E work that the partnership is doing, because it's not just our M&E, but it's a broader range of activities that are kind of all coming together with the goal to really set standards for impact measurement and monitoring in the long run. So one of our activities is the M&E framework and the indicators and objectives that we are currently defining for this, for the 6 result areas. Then we have also commissioned the development of a theory of change that can set out the theoretical background and really enable us to get a more coherent approach to M&E. Then building on the framework, we will also refine and continue developing a survey for programs, and an analysis tool that enables us to gather all these data that we need to track progress on an annual basis, some of the indicators on a longer term basis, and really working on our data collection. And then finally, we work on the evidence roadmap, which means looking at creating a more holistic research agenda for impact evaluation and enhancing evidence and until 2025. And we do this together also with MCII and also as part of our impact working group together with the members of this group. So what does impact now mean for the InsureResilience Global Partnership? So talking about impact, we are always looking at two dimensions in a way. So we have this more inward bound perspective, which is the impact of the partnership. Our goal is, of course, to identify and assess the different ways in which the partnership can affect the resilience of poor and vulnerable people, because this is our vision. This is what is spelled out in our vision. And this work aims to build on the theory of change and will then feed into our result area 5, which was the development and human impact mostly. And the other perspective that we have is more outward bound. It's looking at the impact of CDRFI more broadly. So working on increasing evidence on the impact and the pro-poor design of CDRFI solutions. And this then aims to feed into a larger agenda for impact evaluation, and also with the ultimate goal to support learning and innovation, for example, around what are the enabling conditions for different kinds of instruments and settings, and what can we learn from this going forward and in the way that we set up our programs. And this will then ideally feed into our result area 6, which is increasing evidence. And well, to close, just a few thoughts on the challenges. So why is this workshop important? Why is this kind of work important for us? And why is measuring impact challenging sometimes? These are only some of the examples, and I'm sure this week we will talk about a lot more that's out there. What we can see within the partnership is that we cover a lot of different financial instruments on very different levels, meso, micro and macro levels, and of course these require very many different kinds of methodologies also. So this is a challenge in itself in the way that we have to set this up. And then we're talking about resilience a lot. So this is a complex and multidimensional concept, and this of course can be challenging in the context of impact evaluations. So how do we measure this? What indicators, what aspects do we include? How can we create an index that's actually reliable and useful? So these are the thoughts that we will also like to take further in this topic. Then more generally speaking, I mean, of course, the instruments or climate and disaster risk finance and instruments are still relatively new when it comes to the development context. So what is still lacking as reliable long-term evaluations? So we are looking at different timeframes here. So when we talk about impact, of course, we have to adopt a much longer perspective. Then the studies that we can see, impact studies, often have a clear bias towards the micro insurance setting, and also often in an agricultural context. So we see the need also to expand this kind of knowledge to different settings, other sectors, and really work on covering instruments more broadly. Then another issue always, of course, also is the need for more consistency and quality around data and the way data is collected. And finally, it can also be challenging or difficult to measure the impact of these instruments in non-payout situations. And I think it would be particularly valuable to do that more and look at what the value of CDRFI can be also beyond payout situation. What's the value of these instruments in themselves, for example, and that they enable better and more reliable planning, give security to the policyholders, etc. So these are just some ideas to close with, and now I'm handing over to Sönke.
Thank you, Katharina, and also for these nice reflections. I think we will have ample time to also discuss these over the coming days. So my role is basically to explain a little bit on what is going to be the purpose and objectives of the evidence roadmap. I was also asked to explain a little bit about the purpose principles, and I also want to show you some lessons from the process of actually developing these principles. So quickly, I'm Sönke Kraft. I lead MCI as an executive director, but what I'm also doing is I'm co-chairing the impact working group of the Insurance Global Partnership. That group actually evolved from the work that was done in the context of the principles, which I was also co-chairing back then. I'm doing this together with Dan Birnbaum from Global Parametric, as well as Vosita from Slide and Trust, and they will also take active roles in the coming days. So quickly, in terms of the topic of evidence, it was already framed by Jen in the beginning. I think we really have momentum on the topic. It is clear that the topic of climate and disaster risk finance in itself received much more political attention over the past years, from the Paris Agreement, from G7, G20, and also the Climate Action Summit. But specifically looking at what does it mean in terms of evidence, how is this actually working? Is this actually a good approach? Is also something I think where the Insurance Global Partnership has to work on. So one area directly linked to it, and Katharina mentioned it already in the beginning, is that in the Vision 2025, there's this specific result area on increase in evidence, and in terms of strategic guidance, there should also be kind of activities behind that to actually facilitate the uptake of further evidence in the future, and this is one of them, certainly at the beginning of the period until 2025. If you look at actually, and this is like just a little Web of Science research I've done, if you look at the hits in terms, and here I use the keyword climate risk insurance, but you can also use other ones like climate and disaster risk finance. If you do that, you will see that actually the number of peer-reviewed journal articles is increasing over time. So there's a clear trend that also academics are kind of reacting to the momentum that the topic received, that the community received, and that there is an increase in at least peer-reviewed journal articles. That, however, doesn't mean that all these people necessarily work together. And I think the Insurance Global Partnership, or generally partnerships at this level, they take their value out of different stakeholder groups, different actors working together, say the academic community, but also implementing communities, countries that give their perspectives and their expectations towards this emerging field. I also thought a little bit around the challenge of receiving more momentum. I think it's essentially a scaling up challenge. So this is a graph I adopted from the literature. So it's about scaling up, but it's also about scaling out and scaling deep. So it's not only about say the numbers of programs. Obviously, this is an important area. And impacting more individuals is also actively encouraged through the indicator framework of the global partnership. But it's also about doing this kind of deeper changes to organizations, institutions, and societies, and also to individual behavior. And when we are thinking about the topic of evidence, it is important that we think about it in the context of upscaling programs, and also don't develop approaches that are not realistic for like a project setup. But at the same time, it's also important to not forget about this kind of scaling up and scaling deep challenges of changing actually the setup of societies and the setup of behaviors. I also thought about what is the relevance of evidence, and with appreciation, I actually saw that different actor groups registered for these events, not only academic, and I think this is actually very positive, because I do think that maybe out of myself, we are working in an academic setup. Maybe the end result might be journal articles from that perspective, but it has to go much further. I was just like brainstorming about what could be the interest of different actors moving this topic forward in a strategic way. But I also want to discuss this with all of you over the coming days. I mean, clearly governments have to demonstrate the public value of CDRFI approaches moving forward. Is it money well spent? And it's a multidimensional kind of value that needs to be shown. Civil society actors also might be interested in the topic. They have an important role to play to influence programs, governments, and other actors. And it's also important to base that on solid evidence of the community. And also, in addition, ground truthing, bringing in additional perspectives that are sometimes the, say, academic community is not particularly taking into account. I think it's also a very important role that these actors can play. Private sector should have an interest in benchmarking their approaches, their products along the most recent evidence to have sustainable interventions in the markets. And implementing agencies certainly also should encourage this topic to do interagency learning. The topic is too big for any single actor, and also to look for programmatic improvements. And then lastly, surely academia, we are set up in a way that this is our work, and I think it's also important that this is relevant to other actors, and academic actors can prove their societal relevance. And I think by coming together, this is possible. I quickly want to talk about the IGP Purple principles. So they have been endorsed by the highest level of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership. And they were also coming out of a similar effort, a working group of interested individuals coming together, pushing this topic forward. There are soft guidance for different actors to actually operationalize what's called a pro-poor focus in the in the concept note, the governing instrument, so to say, of the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. There are 5 principles. I won't have time to go into all the sub-details. Again, they also strengthen and highlight the role of evidence, for example, in ensuring quality, ownership, and complementarity. But these are 5 principles that should influence actors in actually participating and bringing in different perspectives into the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. The document, the link is, I think, shown in the presentation. It's also on the Insurance Resilience website. And I encourage everyone to have a look into it. What I liked about or like about the brochure is also that it does give a specific guidance to different actor groups. So it says what it should mean to governments. It also says what it should mean to international development partners, civil society organizations, or the private sector, for instance. So this on the context, and I do think the Insurance Resilience principles, they provide an important framing also into the question on creating an evidence agenda. At the end of the day, they reflect consensus reached of the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. I also wanted to talk to you about the process of getting those principles, because we actually did something like a similar approach. I will highlight the parallels, I hope. So back then, within the what back then was called the PUPO Principle Working Group, we actually facilitated a literature review, did a coding framework of different principal approaches that are important for this topic, that are relevant for the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. Some were coming from the civil society sector, others were coming more from the academic sector. We did a coding framework at MCI back then, and also coding exercise, and derived at some draft principles where consensus is reflected in the literature. And then we had a big workshop with different stakeholders in the context of the working group. We actually also engaged people that were not directly working or were not directly organized as part of the IGP. I think this is important in these kind of efforts, that there's no discrimination, so to say. So it really is about getting the more the merrier, getting as many practitioner views as possible, and engaging these people. So we had this workshop, and I think it was a really good experience, a one-day workshop. And then afterwards, there was a editorial team looking at the outcomes of the workshop, drafting a first document. And then we had a very elaborated and inclusive commenting process, a little bit like the IPCC, where we actually reacted to all comments and also showed not all comments are actually going in the same direction. I think this is also very normal to be expected. But to basically show how we took these comments on board, and then we were able to deliver a draft which then was also adopted with some discussions by the high-level consultative group of the IGP. And I think this was a very good experience. Many voices have been taken on board, and some kind of broader stakeholder consensus could be reflected. So in terms of the evidence roadmap itself, I hope by now you got the difference that it's not about necessarily looking inwards towards the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership, but really looking outwards towards the broader impact of the CDRFI debate, and how to support these through a systematic evidence creation moving forward. So the idea is to also develop a high-level document, a strategic document, which shows the role of evidence in CDRFI, which will depict some of the big trends, also show some of the important normative frameworks, highlight joint agendas, also thinking about what is already important knowledge. Because yes, it might be true that the kind of increase in programs, funding, work areas wasn't necessarily accompanied by evidence per se or scientific literature necessarily, but there have been advances in the past. There is authoritative research out there which is impacting a lot of what we are doing, and I think it's important that as a community we can also show what these kind of current knowledge and synthesis of current knowledge says. It's about looking at ongoing knowledge frontiers, also some of the areas where individual actors are working on, identified as like important issues for the community. But it is also about filling the kind of voids and white spots. And Katharina already mentioned some in her intervention. So where maybe also teamed collaborative pursuit is necessary in the future. And then this being a strategic document, it should also include something like a plan on how to get there, at least at the highest aggregate level, to also be operational and to show how until 2025 this objective of increased evidence can be reached. That said, I think what we hope to get out of it, if this can be successful, is also kind of to give an orientation to the community itself, and also maybe influence, for example, big research funding agencies and things like that in directing also support for this type of work. Okay, and it's the same slide more or less than the one I presented on the proper principles, just that the process is not that far. So again, it's about collecting a synthesis on what's out there. And I do have to thank my co-chairs for contributing and the other authors, and also especially Jen for doing this. This should be the basis for our work moving forward in the coming days. We would have liked to have a workshop where we can actually talk to each other in person, but this is not possible. I think we can replace that with like this kind of virtual engagement. It's also kind of the first endeavor in this of this nature. So it's a little bit an experiment, but I think it is possible, and the turnout numbers are really encouraging. So we do foresee this kind of virtual engagement to collect as many voices as possible with academics and practitioners this week. And then following from this, we will have a synthesis, and we will obviously also brief all the participants and move this work forward as part of the impact working group of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership. Initially, we were thinking about launching the document at COP26. Obviously, you know that COP26 has been postponed to next year, so we will look at the appropriate timing and also the appropriate type of event to publish this, and then this will also be an IGP endorsed document at the end. Okay. I hope this was clear on what we hope to achieve as part of this workshop, and also as part of the work of the impact working group of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership. And I would now hand over to Svenja for some further framing on this first day.
Okay, well, thank you very much for these introductory remarks. Let me just open up. Okay, so First of all, it's great to be with you. Unfortunately, I'm still in my home office here, which doesn't look as, amazing as the MCII studio. I'm very jealous there. I also have to give you a warning. I just discovered that there is a wasp flying around just kind of 1 meter away from me. So if I suddenly start to look a bit panicked, then that's related to that and not to, to the workshop. So apologies for that. But it's great to be here. And I'm also looking forward to the discussion and, well, indeed, the rest of the workshop. And I know there has been a lot of work being put into that. So many thanks for all the efforts of the team. I guess my role here is to offer maybe a few sort of reflections, from the research side, although, I felt when listening to the sort of previous outline, I think we need to be a bit careful about, the research angle here, because a lot of these things are, happening on the ground. And, sometimes it feels like, we're sitting here in the ivory tower and commenting on something that is sort of happening on the ground. And I think, that's not the kind of research we're doing. And most of the other, indeed, academics or researchers in this field are actually very applied. So, because I think that's really important. So maybe at this note, a lot of what I'm saying today is sort of based on work I'm doing with Akitesh Panda, who's a research officer in our institute, and who's been running a few case studies with me. So just wanting to highlight that. So I guess what I'm trying to sort of put out there is a bit of a, sort of setting the scene. A lot of that is basically very much in line what we've just heard. But I think sometimes, I think particularly in the context of monitoring and evaluation, there are still a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions out there. And, I sometimes feel, I've been working in this space around sort of climate insurance, disaster insurance for a long, long time. And I sometimes feel like, I've also experienced it from different sides. And I guess, there is misunderstanding because there are also different expectations about this instrument. And I sometimes feel, it's heavily unfair because, there is this one instrument and there's so many expectations are being packed onto it. And then it becomes actually quite difficult to actually see what it does on the ground. So maybe that as a sort of starting point there. But I guess, nevertheless, it is important to reflect on what, success and, well, also failure. Nobody likes to talk about failure, but, there are examples of where insurance pilots have not worked or where, have not been continued. So, there's a lot that we can learn from that. But what does actually success mean? And then, yes, impact, the holy grail of a lot of these questions. Can we demonstrate impact and the causality of, is this actually due to insurance or, was insurance contributing to that? And how can we measure the impact? So that's kind of a little bit the idea behind the next couple of minutes, where I just want to share a few thoughts here. I've kind of structured it along 3 steps. So I think it's really important to start with understanding, that the use of climate, well, I use CDRI as an acronym. There you go. It starts already with confusion around acronyms. So in my case, it's climate and disaster risk insurance. So I know risk finance is obviously broader. So here we're using risk insurance. So I think the starting point is really to understand aims and objectives and also in which context they are. And I'll come to that in a minute. And then success criteria vary hugely depending on who you ask. If we would be all in a room, I would now go out and ask you, to raise your hand and say, what do you determine as a successful CDRI, or, what would you feel is success in terms of implementing insurance? And I'm sure I would get a lot of different answers and different, perspectives on that. And that's important that we understand and recognize that. And then, selecting tools and indicators. As we know, these discussions around the vision 2025, how can we operationalize that? And I guess maybe just as a sort of main message, I think it is, I find it sometimes, well, not sometimes, I find it unacceptable that we do not have a really good grasp of monitoring and evaluation after actually quite a long time of playing around with these tools. I mean, we're not just starting, yesterday, and now suddenly we realize that we need to monitor and evaluate that. And I think, there is this really an urgency. I mean, in my view, it really needs to be there from day one, that you have a really concrete monitoring and evaluation approach actually set up before you go and implement something. So yeah, just as a little pointer there. So just, when we sort of use these terms, success, performance, impact, I just thought from a sort of research perspective, when we look at analyzing existing instruments, potential innovations and so on, there are a couple of things that I guess in terms of terminology that are important. So one is around benefits, and that clearly also links to this idea of who are the beneficiaries. So I've kind of listed there a couple. Then it's this notion of impact channels. There's direct, could also be indirect, could be in the context of broader policy implications, could also lead to change in distribution of risk. So you can sort of already see the different dimensions of impact there. And then one thing that we should never ever forget in all this is obviously there are costs, and there are costs attached. And when we're talking about, the benefits, we need to talk about the cost. And, that is not just the cost for, an insurance instrument in terms of initial funding, set up, the premium. But, there are also opportunity costs and, weighing whether or not insurance is the right approach or something else might be more effective. And then potentially also maladaptation as a cost. And then clearly also the question of who pays, equity, fairness implications. So just sort of flagging this, because to me, it's not just an economic question of, can you come up with a cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis, and that will tell us, at what level, what type of instrument works best for whom, under which conditions. If it would be that easy, I guess we wouldn't have this this workshop. So I think we just need to recognize, there are different, different layers, and there are different sort of, approaches that you need to actually narrow this down to something that you can work with. Yes, so understanding the why. So I would argue that it's really key if we want to have a good monitoring evaluation system. You start with the problem statement of what is it actually that whoever designs, implements, funds, but also whoever, uses insurance wants to achieve with that. And that is often part of the theory of change. And, you have sometimes really complicated and long and really sort of, hard to sort of track documents that try and bring this to a fore. What is, what's the problem? I've just highlighted a couple of different things here. So really, again, depending on the context, and here it is from, from a sort of development partner's perspective. I did this in some work for KfW, just to sort of helping them also to understand under which conditions, what instruments might work. So, I've just listed that here because to me that is like the first thing, the problem statement. And I guess we kind of almost assume that, yes, it is to reduce poverty, and it is to increase resilience, and it is to, to achieve the sustainable development goals. Well, we kind of all see this there, but then what is the more concrete, what specifically is it that you want to achieve? And I think there you notice that, not only is it a question of different instruments, whether they be sovereign, meso or micro, but also what specifically are you trying to achieve? And I think that is, in my own experience, that is often where a lot of misunderstandings happen, particularly between sort of funders, private sector partners, but also beneficiaries. So in a sort of paper that Architesh and I just put out yesterday as a working paper. There's a link below. We thought, just to highlight, for us, we are sort of operating across different domains. And, I think that's important because, they're all kind of driven by very, distinct but also overlapping ambitions. And we've kind of broken it down into 4 domains. And, you can have a huge academic discussion whether this is the right way to frame it, distinctions made, and whether this is all, just too academic. But I think the reason why I think it is useful, because it shows you in which context we're actually trying to use insurance, particularly in the context of developing countries, and what the underpinning sort of community is that is working on this. And they can actually be very different. So, if you are looking at this from a loss and damage perspective under the UNFCCC, you have a different view on what insurance and in what context than if you are doing this as part of a broader disaster risk finance strategy. That might sound obvious, but I can just repeat myself. I've seen a lot of misunderstanding and confusion happening, things getting lost in translation. So hence this idea of, just making that quite clear up front. And then I guess the next question, which I mentioned earlier, is sort of what does success mean and for whom? So again, I would love to do this as a sort of mini survey with yourselves. Instead, we've just listed, this is by no way sort of exhaustive. These are just some possible success criteria. So, I think it just shows you also, what sort of matters to whom, and what is then important if you want to make this suitable and also design insurance in a way that it meets the needs. And in some cases, there might even be some trade-offs between, what the private sector wants, what development partners can do, and what individual beneficiaries actually need. So again, I think it's really important to try and understand this up front, and also be quite open and honest about this, and not sort of assume that we're all pulling in the same direction. Because I think sometimes we aren't, or these partners aren't. And I guess, understanding different success criteria, different stakeholders, then it's a question of, analyzing the performance of insurance. And that's kind of what we're talking about, this sort of evidence, what is it, what is available, what information is there that we can use. And I sometimes feel I'm a bit torn because, on one hand, I know also from my experience working insurance in a sort of developed country context, OECD country context, it is almost impossible to give you really good data that shows, the performance and the impact of some insurance products. So if you ask me about flood insurance in the UK, it is not that we have a huge amount of really strong data that allows me to answer that question. But I think the big caveat is, I think we should be much more focused on this, in particular in developing countries, and where the idea is to be pro-poor and to bring this to, most vulnerable populations, because we're playing around with something that's new. And, we just need to have a much, much better understanding of what's going on the ground, and whether it actually meets the needs, and, therefore experience of beneficiaries as well as experience of providers is important. And then the key part, and I know we all would acknowledge that, but I think sometimes that also gets lost, is the resilience dimension. We use resilience as a term, almost saying by default what we're doing here is supporting resilience. I guess the first question is, well, if so, how? And then I would also argue, there's a long-term resilience, because we know that what we're designing might be there to deal with current risk, but how does it also support long-term resilience? So these are the sort of key dimensions there. And well, how you then move to indicators. I mean, this is again a sort of exercise in terms of doing, sort of mapping out, I think, differentiating between sort of input, output, outcome, impact, and we've kind of listed a couple of them here. And we all know that obviously the more you move towards impact, the harder it gets and the more difficult it is to then sort of underpin that with evidence. But I think, if we set out with these ambitions and if we say, within our domains, we want to achieve X, Y, and Z and create this kind of impact, well, then we need to have a strong way of commenting how we meet those goals. And causality is obviously also a key thing, and happy to come back to that in the discussion, because obviously insurance is not operating isolated in isolation. There are lots of other things happening. So that's important. And that can lead to hugely complex exercises. I mean, I'm not sort of criticizing colleagues here, Prabhakar, who did this in 2015. This is actually quite a useful and interesting exercise. But, for someone who's implementing insurance on the ground or who is designing it, you also need to have something that is pragmatic and that is also, doable, sort of right now, rather than relying on a 10-year, sort of RCT analysis. So just as a caveat, and we've kind of did a bit of a stock take and looking at existing methods that are out there. And yes, I mean, there is a mix of qualitative, quantitative approaches. Many of you will have used one or the other, or maybe some of them, or ideally all of them together. They all come with, advantages and disadvantages. I think my plea is, not to discount the qualitative evaluation, because I know, particularly when it comes to, to sort of funders and also to policymakers, I mean, they want to see some numbers, and, we all agree that that's really important. But I think, the quality and things that you pick up through qualitative evaluations can be actually sometimes much more informative than what we can gather through quantitative evaluations. And just to illustrate that, this is a particular sort of, pet project that Akitesh and I, and also our colleague Abigail Clare, have been exploring, is this idea of, doing monitoring evaluation through subjective measures. And, this is kind of a slightly different approach, but what you really do is you look at the experience of, beneficiaries, but also experience of government officials, the experience of companies who are involved in this. And you ask them for their perspective and the sort of their own ranking of how they think an instrument has done X, Y, and Z. There are potential benefits. I've listed some here. Challenges, yes. Some people might think it is also gameable. But I think it's definitely worth to consider this as an important element in any monitoring evaluation approach, because it also brings in the perspective and the experience that people have with an instrument. And we've done this, we've tested this. Akit has been doing this in India. There's a photo of us talking to farmers, and similarly, we talked also to insurance providers, government officials. And in a way, it is a rather pragmatic approach, but I think it still offers a lot of learning and insights. And, at the end of the day, if we're talking about resilience, it's also about experiencing your own resilience. And, if a farmer feels that having insurance has increased their resilience, I think that sends a strong signal. You can then probe why they think it is or why they don't think it is, or, how, you can ask them how it sort of has changed maybe their behavior. But this sends a really strong signal, I think, when you try and understand impact. And then, finally, monitoring evaluation shouldn't be seen as an afterthought. I mean, I made this point earlier. And I mean, it's obviously not a linear process. I mean, this diagram that you see here, again, that was part of the work I did for KfW, where the question was, how do you make decisions around how to support insurance? And, I think the idea was not to say, well, if you've done all of that, you also need to do a monitoring evaluation approach. I think, that would be the wrong way of looking at it, because you actually should, the moment you define objectives, you actually need to think about, how can I evaluate whether I achieve them, and sort of do that in parallel. And in a little bit, we're trying to catch up, I think, with this challenge. And I have a lot of sympathy for, also colleagues at Insure Resilience and at other insurance providers who are kind of, really, they want to have a workable monitoring evaluation approach, but in a way having to play a bit of catch up. And I guess the idea of this workshop is also to offer support and insights as much as we can. And I hope that kind of helped a little bit to set the scene. And very much looking forward to our discussion. And any questions, let us know. And just as an update, the wasp seemed to have disappeared, so I'm still all right here. No wasp attack. So thank you very much.
Okay, quickly changing the PowerPoint deck again. Thank you, Svenja, for providing your insights and really interesting. And I think you also put some challenges to us. I think it is important that I think actually the value of this week's workshop is actually that we have the chance to talk with different perspectives on this topic, specifically on this topic. And then obviously, this is also something I want to say. We probably won't finish all the discussions we need to have. Definitely, we will also need some follow-up conversation. But yes, thank you for this interesting inputs. Just quickly giving you an idea around the week. This is a kind of conceptual picture I developed yesterday, honestly. And I was looking for some way to show it. So basically, we are on the first day, and it's about developing the framing of the house. We also discussed quite a bit on what is the right setup to actually have meaningful discussions, because they're really different. We're aggregating different communities within a broader field of work. We were thinking about different streams, also the evidence briefs. They were organized along thematic areas. So we're talking about microinsurance, meso-insurance aggregation, macro policy solutions that are relevant for entire countries. We are talking about the sovereign risk pools that have a very specific role to play in the setup and in implementing some of the objectives of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, as well as non-insurance approaches and solutions that are relevant for the CDRFI debate. So these are the windows and doors of the house we want to use to look into the house. We will have that largely tomorrow in the breakout groups and with the facilitation of the moderators and with the help of the evidence briefs. And then we will also have to think about what are some of the kind of overarching messages we want to take out that are actually overarching on all of these themes. And I thank you, Svenja, for raising some. For example, how do we actually, you put a little bit of a conundrum to us to say it should be kind of a concrete way on measuring success and also measuring our own objectives. At the same time, it is also contextual, and not all of it is known at at the beginning of an intervention. So at the end, it's kind of learning forward in implementation, and also in this specific work. It's about hypothesis testing. It's about failing in the safe space to actually fail. And I think this is a real problem for those that are working also on implementation. We are bound to succeed. This is the way it is put to us. So at the same time, we know that probably some of the advancements that are done are actually not done from success, but are done from failure. I think this is also important when we talk about the role of evidence for the wider community. So it is about having these overarching discussions, taking these out, also looking at some cross-cutting themes. They were discussed in the beginning, for example, gender is important to all of these thematic areas, but there might be other cross-cutting items that we should pick up specifically in further developing this evidence roadmaps. We already said we want to address it from the perspective of gaps and challenges, and then obviously also discuss individual way forwards in outlining the roadmap. Okay, with that. Oops, sorry, I did it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Zunka, and thank you, Swenja, so much for that. I was just reflecting also when you mentioned, you know, how we're kind of bound. We feel this need to succeed, and also the importance, we were talking about the importance of evidence. And I was also thinking about the challenges that we even have in the academic community publishing null results papers. So even if we do find that a particular solution may not be successful, it may even be difficult in some circumstances to publish that. So there are a lot of a lot of different challenges, and we're excited to talk over the course of the week about some of the solutions that we can find for moving forward. So we just wanted to briefly, before we open it up for discussion, highlight how we're going to move forward for the rest of the week. So Zunka already talked about the different thematic areas, and I think particularly given how Swenja broke down their different domains, we see there are a lot of different ways to kind of pull apart this huge topic that is climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. So we are taking a thematic approach for tomorrow. We do have those different breakout groups. We really hope to have a very active and lively discussion tomorrow based on those thematic areas and the evidence briefs that have been circulated to participants and are also available on our webpage. But we also recognize that, you know, though that may not be the best way to organize the brief or the information or our thought processes. So we do hope to also talk about better ways to structure better things that we may be missing if we focus with this thematic approach. And I think that it'll be on Thursday that we dig into some of those things. So tomorrow, we'll all be focused on the breakout groups. The vast majority of the time will be spent with our excellent moderators. We have moderators from UC Davis, from Global Parametrics, from Ripple Economics, from Slack and Trust, and from the Center for Disaster Protection. So we're really excited about the moderators who've provided their time to lead those breakout discussions tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we'll have brief readouts from each of the groups to understand what were the kind of seminal pieces that were discussed, where do they view in each of those thematic areas the evidence frontier is, where they think the gaps are that really need to be the focus of some research moving forward. But then we also want to have a joint conversation about, okay, so if those are the gaps in those different thematic areas, are we missing other wide open spaces by taking this thematic approach? What are the challenges, perhaps methodological or otherwise, that we have in addressing some of these gaps? And how is all of this going to feed into that evidence roadmap? And then, also, as Zunka mentioned, in terms of cross-cutting themes, on Thursday, we will also have a presentation on the role of gender in CDRFI, and how that maybe should be addressed more systematically in our evidence work going forward. And then on Friday, we'll start to work together to think about what are some of the key components of the roadmap, how different people who are participating in the workshop want to be involved, starting to flesh that out so that hopefully by the end of the week we can have what we're calling a zero draft. And then we'll just discuss next steps and close on Friday. So today is the only day where we're doing this webinar format, and we hope to be really inclusive and participatory for the rest of the week. So with that, we're going to move to Q&A. I see there have been a couple of questions already put in the Q&A function on Zoom, so please continue to post those. We have plenty of time, so I'll kind of moderate, and we'll have Swenja on from London, as well as our panelists here, Katarina and Zunka. So I think we can turn off the PowerPoint now. So I'll just start with two kind of specific questions that came in from the audience. One is, does MCAI or the Institute of Resilience Global Partnership have a country or regional focus? And also, would you like to develop an ex-ante impact framework? So maybe we can start with the two of you on that.
Yeah, maybe I can give my perspective, and you want to continue on that. So with regard to the Institute of Resilience Global Partnership, we don't have a regional focus. The partnership operates worldwide. The focus is on vulnerable countries. So of course, as we are a G20, V20 partnership, the V20 countries have a very important role in the partnership, but also other countries that classify, and we have a clear definition of that also in our M&E framework. And then maybe going on with the second question, which was about the ex-ante impact framework. So maybe I need to distinguish here. So when we talk about an impact framework, what we are currently doing with this inward perspective on the partnership is that we are commissioning a theory of change, and this theory of change will then look at what the pathway to change will be for the partner, or could be for the partnership, and how can the partnership actually work towards achieving its vision. So looking at the impact level, going all the way down to outcomes, outputs, and activities specifically. And this will enable us to see how change can be achieved. And this is what I would call an ex-ante impact framework for the partnership, because this will then form the basis for our M&E, or for our impact measurement, in terms of how the partnership makes impact. And this looks more broadly really also at partnership wide, so looking at all the different stakeholders that are involved, and that will certainly be quite challenging for a multi-stakeholder partnership, because there's so many different actors that come into play and that have different activities going on. So with a theory of change, we aim at putting something like this in place that will enable us to then going forward measure progress.
Okay, I mean, since MCI is also on the board, I mean, first I just want to clarify, this is not going to be an MCI output. And MCI and IGP are definitely not the same thing. So MCI is a think tank on the topic. We do contribute to the Institute of Resilience Global Partnership, and we do see this as a relevant forum for international cooperation on this topic, but we're not the same. Nevertheless, since MCI was specifically asked to respond, so I'll do this. In terms of country and regional focus. As an institution, we don't have a specific country or regional focus necessarily, but we do have the same thing. We work specifically to contribute to resilience efforts in developing country. And so you won't see us necessarily working in developed countries. And in terms of the ex-ante impact framework, I would encourage this as an organization. We also worked on it, and we provided. You will also in the impact in the evidence briefs. You will also see some literature that actually we contributed to. I think it's an important topic. It falls in this area also on kind of non-payout situations. So I would encourage you, I can't see who contributed that question, but I would encourage you to bring up this topic also in one of the breakout groups tomorrow.
Thank you, Zunka. So I also just wanted to add on to that point you made about how this is not an MCI product. Yes, so definitely we view the roadmap, the evidence roadmap, is contributing to some of the objectives under the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership, but that is not the sole ambition of the roadmap. The roadmap is really supposed to be a global public good or a community public good for the different stakeholders in this space, including donors, governments, researchers and academics, CSOs, NGOs and implementers, as well as the private sector, and how we can all come together, see our different entry points perhaps, but all come together to really help build the evidence base and contribute to the development of strong CDRFI, disaster risk finance and insurance solutions. Swenja, you're holding up your hand. And then after you comment, I also have a question directly to you.
Yeah, thank you. I went back to the good old handwave. I couldn't find the function. I don't know if I can actually raise my hand here electronically, but you saw me, that's good. I just wanted to come in at those discussions because I think, you know, it's really great to try and bring together all these sort of different players in this. And I think you've done a tremendous amount of work to do that. From my own experience, I would just add two things. So one is, you know, of course, it's good that there's also a bit of a degree of healthy competition, and we now have sort of different stakeholders playing around in this field, and we have the multilateral development banks, we have private sector partners, and I think that is healthy. What I noticed in talking and sometimes also working with those, I don't think there is actually a lot of really fruitful and transparent exchange between all of them. And I think that would be, you know, almost like a plea, if I can frame it like that. I mean, I've been in situations where working in one country, you know, there were several efforts of implementing an insurance scheme by different players. And you know, I could ask the question because I was kind of independent. I said, well, surely would make sense if we talk to each other, if we understand also the different approaches. And that not always happened. And I think that's just an example, but I think this is really important to sort of try and overcome that. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, everything should be, you know, homogeneous and following the same standards or so, but at the very least, having more transparency also and yeah, avoiding duplication, if I can put it that way, that would be important.
Thanks for that. While we have you, Swenja, there was a question specifically to you on how you see the challenge of benefits, margin, and shareholder value in the involvement of the private sector. And if you want to speak more generally about perhaps your perspectives on the potential contributions of the private sector, that's useful as well.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I mean, I think we know that in many of those countries where, you know, insurance is also a new concept, in particular with a view to supporting those most vulnerable and you know, focusing on poverty reduction, that is not necessarily where, you know, the private sector element sort of comes in straight away. And I think it takes a bit of sort of exploring of how the private sector can that. I think there are many examples, and we're seeing, through the Insurance Development Forum, through other groups, that private sector is coming in and offering, not just financial, but also knowledge, advice, and so on. And capacity building is essential there. And I think, again, coming back to this point of clarifying objectives, I mean, if your objective is you want to be strong in a market, you want to raise insurance penetration there, you want to sell products, then you're probably not going to do this in a sort of pro-poor approach, because you're then aiming at, sort of higher income levels in that society, selling car insurance and so on. So I guess, just as a caveat there, I think, there are different roles for the private sector at different levels coming in.
Great, thank you. So I think for these next questions, maybe I'll turn back to the room here. There was a question on, well, a comment that climate vulnerable countries do not yet receive prioritization from donor countries. I think maybe they're drawing a distinction between climate vulnerable and least developed or lower income countries. So what is the Insure Resilience Global Partnership doing to ensure that it is prioritizing vulnerable countries? And can an M&E framework help to prioritize vulnerable countries? And I'd add on to that another comment about how poor and vulnerable people are often paying the price of global inaction or insufficient action to date. And will the M&E framework have strict guidelines on directly reaching the poor and vulnerable as the goal of Insure Resilience Global Partnership? So I think those two are tied.
I think that will be for me. So I'll start. Yes, maybe to start with, I mean, I mentioned earlier that we are V20, G20 partnership. So the V20 play a very important role in the partnership, which means that they are also represented in our high-level consultative group, for example. So this is the highest strategic body of the partnership that sets the overall direction. And so what we did is make sure that we have equal representation also of V20 countries in there. And that means that directly on the strategic level, we have a very close cooperation with some of these countries. And we are also working closely with the V20 Secretariat to ensure that these voices are being integrated into the partnership. And this, of course, is also then reflected in our M&E framework. So we're in close collaboration and discussions with V20 Secretariat and our V20 country partners, and they also give us their perspectives on what they think about impact and the M&E system. So this is kind of directly feeding into the M&E framework. And then I think the framework itself, once we have results, first results and data on this new framework of our Vision 2025, I mean, in the ideal setting, yes, it would help us to also prioritize the countries that are most in need, because the information that we would get would ideally show us where the gaps are and what is still needed, and also what is working, and where we need to look more closely. So for example, one of the indicators that we have looks at comprehensive disaster risk finance strategies, so we can see which countries have this in place already, where can the partnership kind of do more to support these countries. So this is something that we certainly aim to achieve. And then there was a second question. I'll just have a quick look. Right, so this was about how the M&E framework aims to reach poor and vulnerable people. So the definition that we apply for this comes already from the first phase, from the G7 initiative, where we define poor and vulnerable people as according to income levels mostly. So we're saying we're taking the World Bank definition for poverty, $3.1 PPP per day. Anyone below that, and for vulnerable people, we are taking an approach of $15 PPP per day. This is the closest and more like a mixture of a pragmatic approach also to measuring this. There's certainly many more aspects to be taken into consideration. We decided to measure it this way also to keep it feasible and looking at what data can we get at the time. And but this general definition will also be taken into our new M&E framework. And then, of course, this will all be complemented with the pro-poor focus and pro-poor principles.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll turn it over to Zunka in just a second, but just wanted to make sure it's very clear that the M&E framework of the partnership is separate. It's very important, and but it is separate from the roadmap. They are different things. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, just I think I take the first question on whether this effort can help to also prioritize support towards V20 countries. I think there's a lot to unpack actually, because listening to Svenja, she said like probably the highest level of in a way scientific proof in terms of value added through these approaches have to be applied in the context of these countries. Even knowing that some of this evidence is missing in some of the more advanced economies and OECD countries at the same time. So that's one thing I hear. But the other concern I actually have is also that we know that some of the implementing conditions are not so easy. And so at the same time, we also need to have the space that we're not setting in a way the system to fail in these countries and actually discouraging in a way interventions there. I think this is something I also myself have to think about. It goes to the groups in the coming days. It is also then a question on whether the right instruments are used in these contexts. So quite a bit to unpack, I think, for me, and I think also relevant to reflect on it in the coming days. There was also the question on the poor and vulnerable people are paying the price of global inaction, and whether this is also, it says M&E framework. Yes, Jen, thank you for clarifying that we are talking about these two different things. But in terms of the evidence roadmap, I think it's an important notion that should be taken forward within the groups. What is kind of the distributional impact of the solution itself, and also in the context of climate change. So I think, Svenja, you had it as one part of your, what was it, a domain? No, you have to say, but just to say, I think it's an important comment, and I would encourage people to also reflect on it in the discussions tomorrow.
Svenja, there's another question for you, but I don't know if you want to jump in on this first.
No, I think that's fine. I'm happy to move to the next one. I've started typing an answer to one. I don't know if that's sensible or not, but you tell me. But anyway.
Feel free to come back to that. So there was a question here that you had mentioned that there's an opportunity cost, maybe that's the one you were looking at, due to the fact that approaches are not always adapted to the realities on the ground. I would say also just because there are lots of different investment opportunities that are available to governments or donors. And so as of now, is there no way to minimize that risk of perhaps not being the most efficient in the investments? Do we have to go and, the question is, do we have to go in and see what happens?
Well, yeah, that was exactly the question I started to type my answer, because the system showed it as answered, and I said, well, we haven't answered it. So anyway, I'm happy to do this again. So I think, it would be a shame if by now we are not in a better position rather than doing, trial and error. And I think, we are not doing that. There is a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work. But I think two key points where I think we can actually really, minimize that risk, if you like. So one is we just need to be better in learning the lessons from other schemes. And this comes also back to transparency. I mean, when we try and find out data and evidence about schemes how have they been running, why they've been discontinued. That's often a black box. I mean, there is really not that much information out there publicly available. So that's the first thing. We also need to get much better in sort of reporting on these trials, or pilots, if you like. But I think the other one, which I think we just can't underemphasize, is this idea of capacity building. And I've seen, I mean, everybody would agree that investing in capacity building, it should be like the first step before you actually go in and design something. And I would say, well, it shouldn't just be the first step, it should be like a continuous investment. And I've seen it often that this is like a workshop. You set up a workshop, maybe you interview a few beneficiaries, work with some NGOs to get an understanding of what the needs are, and then you use that to design and work around implementation. And I think that it can't be as a one-off event. I mean, it needs to be continuous investment. The whole capacity building is, for me, actually, the really crucial part of making sure that these things do meet the needs, and that we also, have beneficiaries and local partners who understand what these instruments can do and what they can't do. And I think that will get us some way to sort of minimize that risk.
Thank you, Svenja. So I think this was in relation, there was a question here about whether MCAI or Insure Resilience helps the microinsurance sector in different countries in order to reach rural potential clients. I think that may have gone to the capacity building point that Svenja was making, but I don't know if either of you wants to add on.
Maybe just briefly. So we don't have a specific focus on microinsurance in the partnership, but there's a couple of programs that work on this level. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of different instruments and projects under the umbrella of the partnership. I don't know if that helps already. I wouldn't want to go into detail on all of these.
Yeah, it's a little bit on a tangent. So I mean, as MCI, it is like some other teams are working on it. And I also acknowledge that in the evidence brief, we specifically, or it was specifically addressed. So it's again one of the things that will pop up in one of the groups tomorrow. So generally, it is an important area of work. Yet there are many specific challenges in bringing these microinsurance insurance solutions to the rural sector. And we also have this kind of agriculture sector products. We also look into that in the evidence brief, and obviously there's a huge overlap with the rural sector with these products. Yeah.
Thanks, Sunka. Also, I just wanted to share a reflection that I had when Katarina was talking about their different target groups. And I think we haven't really talked about vulnerability and exposure and breaking those apart here. So I just wanted to mention that I think that is something that we will also need to be really explicit about. I mean, I think there is the goal to help support low-income individuals, households, communities that are in remote areas or low-income settings, low-income urban areas as well. But I think that has to be also layered with these understandings and questions about vulnerability and exposure to natural hazards as well. So just wanting to bring that in as another dimension that we want to think about when we think about impact of products and solutions. So moving on to the next question, if I understand it correctly, will the efforts of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership fold into the 2023 global stock taking in terms of bringing more attention to risk management using climate finance for resilience building? Do you have a comment, Katarina?
Not specifically yet, so it's not something that is spelled out somewhere in our vision, but I can imagine that certainly, I mean, it's still some time away, but certainly this could play an important role for the partnership. And also, I mean, generally, I would say that we always advocate for a holistic approach. So taking risk finance and insurance is one part of a broader risk management and risk financing approach. And I think this is also where this question is going. So I would say hopefully yes, but we don't have this specifically spelled out for this global stock take.
Great, thank you. For the next question, I will read the question out loud, but then I'm going to take advantage of moderator's prerogative to kind of change the question for each of you to answer. So the next question is, considering demand-driven, how is this being measured in M&E? Is there an IGP implementation vehicle that was requested for by a country currently being finalized? Is the tripartite agreement, which we haven't discussed at all, I don't think, a result of a country request? So I would say maybe, Katarina, you could respond to some of the Into Resilience Global Partnership specific aspects of demand, perhaps from a country level perspective. I think Zunka, maybe you can touch on the roadmap and what demand means for evidence in terms of the roadmap. And Swenja, if I could ask you to speak to whether there is a demand component in success criteria that you've thought about to date. So perhaps starting with Katarina.
Right, so on the demand, or it's around implementation vehicles. So with the partnerships program alliance, and I haven't mentioned that yet, but what we have under the partnerships implementation work stream is what we call the program alliance, where we have different implementation programs coming together from the World Bank, from KfW, from UNDP, and also the Center for Disaster Protection. And the goal of this program alliance is to ensure more coherence across these different programs, and also to be able to offer kind of a full value chain of services to vulnerable countries, starting with analysis, risk analyses, identifying the right instruments, going to solution design, to implementation of solutions, and also concessional support to finance these solutions. So and the program alliance then kind of gets together to also discuss on their strategic orientation and trying to also align M&E. And the idea is also for countries to approach either the Secretariat or the Program Alliance with their needs and ideas, and then not having to look at each individual program, seeing what is most suitable, but really having this as an entry point to get the full picture of the solutions that are being offered, and then ideally having members of the Program Alliance support them in the implementation of their specific need. And I mean, these sorts of processes takes really a long time. So we have had a couple of country requests that have been forwarded also to the Program Alliance, and the discussions are still in progress. So we don't, I couldn't yet say that we have a product that has been finalized really based on single country demand. But of course, the idea of the Program Alliance and of the partnership is to in the best possible way respond to the demands that we are aware of, that we know of.
Okay. I feel some of these questions are not directly related to the evidence roadmap, but I try to bring it back to the evidence roadmap. What I hope we will achieve in the coming days and maybe only in the writing afterwards is that we actually have that we identify these different entry points for different actors on the topic. So what they really want to get out of it, what are their expectations, how can they contribute? And I do see that obviously governments and also V20 governments are an important stakeholder, maybe one of the most important stakeholders. So and I also saw from the list of participants that we actually do have some people representing government authorities. So again, it's somewhat of a standard answer of myself. So again, I encourage you to take this head in the coming days and also spell this out. What does evidence mean for you? And also what you as a government stakeholder, how can you contribute to that? What do you expect the global community to do? What do you expect the academic community to do? So that we actually also have these kind of statements that can be used then in drafting the actual document moving forward.
And if I could just jump on that before passing over to Swenja, I would say 2 additional components. I totally agree with that, Zunka. I think also this is one area where we would like to, in addition to highlighting the important role that government partners have, also the role of CSOs to help make sure that products, solutions, programs are really relevant to the needs and the lives of people in their communities. And then also I would say this is one of the reasons why we've brought the discussion of the pro-poor principles into this workshop, because the demand-driven products are an important an important component of quality and making sure that the products have impact. So I think that demand-driven perspective is reflected in the pro-poor principles. So Swenja, if I could pass over to you.
Yeah, just echoing what you just said there about civil society, I think playing a hugely important role and are often actually not really part in that process. And I think that's really important, because there's also this sort of local knowledge and understanding of different needs that can be brought into this. I would just say, sort of demand, often people think, oh, this is demand side issue, it is different whether you're talking about microinsurance or, macro level sovereign insurance types, because, there's also different sets of understanding, different types of stakeholders you work with. But I guess, nevertheless, I think, there's sort of the same, almost like the same principles apply. I mean, this is down to, what is the demand related to? I would almost call it demand driven or need driven. Yeah. So, the starting point is a need, there is kind of a shortage, something is missing, and you're looking for a way to address that. And insurance can help you in that. And, I think that's probably a better way of framing this, because, there's hardly anybody who kind of really goes up and says, oh, I really, really, really want insurance now. I mean, insurance is kind of the mechanism that will get you somewhere, but it should be around needs. And then I guess access to insurance is an important thing, because, we've also looked at this in terms of, access to finance, which is a general issue in many parts of the world. And then access to insurance, is there actually, once you've identified the needs, would they actually be able to meet those needs through a market or through something that government provides? And in many cases, it's just not there. So I think that's the other dimension to that.
Great, thank you. And yes, definitely in the macro policy solutions conversation, we are talking about the role of, the evidence brief talks about the role of the government in creating an enabling environment, the role of the government as a regulator and supervisor. So I think that's, making sure that there is even the possibility for some of these solutions to be made available, in addition to the work that needs to be done to increase access, is critical. The other thing I'd mention on the demand side is bringing it back to the opportunity cost, Swenja, that you mentioned, which is that if if solutions are being created, and particularly if solutions are being subsidized that are not really based in need, then that does have a huge opportunity cost, because that means that those investments would be better spent elsewhere if they're not actually meeting the needs of the ultimate client or consumer. So does anybody else have any other points that they want to chime in? I think there are no other unaddressed Q&A topics. If somebody wants to add something in quickly, we can stick around. But if not, any closing remarks?
Well, I mean, not necessarily. I would actually thank everyone, both for contributing. I know it really has been an effort of many to pull the evidence briefs together and to also participate. And I don't see the exact numbers right now on Zoom, but I saw the registration form, etc. So just want to say this. And yeah, and I hope we will have a good week. And with this, I mean, this modality for, at least for me, is new. Also in this kind of setup at the UN campus, we have this facility. We've never used it, so this is new to me. I hope it's going to be successful, and it will also maybe be something that we can move forward even after, in the post-COVID world, if we get there at some point. Just from my perspective, thanking you and seeing you all again tomorrow and in the coming days.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to the participation, this is a new opportunity and a new framework that we're trying out, a new way of getting participation. So while we hope that everybody takes advantage of the asynchronous participation options, we would also appreciate feedback on those and whether you think that they were successful or not. Swenja?
Yeah, no, just also obviously looking forward to the following discussions. I just wanted to maybe close my sort of input by, just a bit of a, reflection. I mean, what we're talking about are in some cases new innovative approaches, but by and large, we've been playing around with this and implementing and designing this for quite some time now. And sometimes it feels like it could be actually quite healthy to reread what came up at the very early days of these discussions. And again, it sort of chimes in with my plea. We're kind of trying to play a bit of catch up now with monitoring evaluation, but sometimes I read like papers from 2005, 2006, raising similar questions and similar issues. And I think sometimes we just need to also put a hand on heart and say, where is the real progress here, and where's the real difference? And I guess maybe just as a bit of a reality check here. So hopefully, obviously, this will get us to progress, but just as a reminder.
Great. Well, thank you for those last reflections, and thanks everybody again for your participation. And we look forward to speaking with you all tomorrow and seeing your lovely faces on your Zoom. So great. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.